I'm here in Charleston Cemetery where we have ancestors where we're going to start. We're going to actually start about our stories. So I'm standing here in front of Finity and Mary Daybell's tombstone. So we have a starting point to our story and again, your connection to the Daybells.
As far back as we can go is with John Daybell being born in Kirby-on-the-Bane, Lincolnshire. This is in 1664. His son, Joseph Daybell, born again in Lincolnshire. Then Joseph Daybell, the son of Joseph Daybell, born in Lincolnshire. And then Samuel Daybell in 1773. Notice how all four generations are spelling their name. Starting now in the 1800s, we have Finity Daybell and then his daughter, Sarah Daybell. This is where the spelling of the name changes. So let's take a second and just explore the area where the Daybells came from. Lincolnshire is a county in what they call the East Midlands of England. It lies on the east coast with a long coastline on the North Sea. It is the second largest county in England. It is predominantly for agricultural use. Lincolnshire not only has historical sites that are from the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, but the prehistoric Stone Age, where artifacts have been found here. If only we had a record to show just how far our ancestors go back to this area. So now our story begins with Finity. Finity was the 9th child out of 13 born on March 11, 1814. He was the son of Samuel Daybell and Rebecca Ham. When Finity was 12, his father died. This left the family extremely poor, so Finity at the time had to hire out to farmers around the area to work on their farms. In England, under the local parish, fatherless boys who were poor were given money to help their families. Through Finity's parish, as Lackby, he was given 1 shilling a month. Now today that 1 shilling a month would be about 6 cents. When Finity was 16 years old, the parish decided that they weren't legally responsible for paying Finity the shilling, that the shilling was just too much. So they issued what they called a removal order, which removed all legal and financial responsibilities from the parish to the boy. So we're going to leave Finity for just a minute while he grows up and talk about Mary Draper. Mary Draper was born in Haseby, Lincolnshire on January 6, 1820 to Richard Draper and Anne Green. She was the oldest of 4 children. Now unfortunately, Mary's father died when she was 8 years old and the youngest daughter in their family was a year old. When she was 12, she had to go to work. And at the age of 16, she went to work as a lady's maid. Mary lived with a lady for 5 years before she died, and when she died, she did leave Mary with a black suit and a little bit of money. Finity met Mary when she was 16 years old. He courted her until she was 21, and after the lady she had been working for died, they got married. So Finity and Mary Daybell were married on February 9, 1841 in Lincolnshire, England. He was 27, Mary was 21, and they were blessed with 10 children. In 1844, some Mormon missionaries came to their town and taught the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, Finity accepted it right away, but it took Mary a little bit longer. They were told that they should go to America to be with the saints. They would have to work for years before they could afford to travel overseas. A couple of years after being introduced to the church, while working, Finity shatters his shoulder while carrying a plank. He was unable to work for 3 years. The family had no one to support them, so they were forced to go to the poorhouse. Finity was sent to one place, and Mary and her youngest to another place. Robert, their 4-year-old, was taken away from his mother and cried constantly. The concept of the poorhouse originated in England during the 17th century. Municipalities were expected to care for their poor and made a distinction between those who were old and unable to care for themselves and the able-bodied. People who were able to work were expected to do so and could be imprisoned if they refused. Poorhouses or workhouses were bare-bone facilities designed to make poverty even less attractive. In these facilities, poor people ate thrifty, unpalatable food, slept in crowded quarters, often in unsanitary conditions. They were put to work breaking stones, crushing bones, spinning cloth, or doing domestic labor, among other jobs. So basically, your poorhouses or workhouses were designed to punish people for their poverty. Finity worked in the cornmeal with other men, and it was hard work. But after 3 weeks, Mary told Finity she would rather starve than listen to her boy cry all day long. So on New Year's Day in 1847, they moved back home. At the time, Mary then had to take in washing to support the family until Finity was able to work again. 20 years passed after they were first introduced to the church. They had to save enough money to travel to the Promised Land. The first to leave was their 15-year-old daughter, Susan. And a year later, Finity, Mary, Sarah, George, and Elizabeth left on May 21st, 1864, and boarded the ship, the General McClellan, to cross the ocean for America along with 882 other members of the church. Because they did not have much money, they had to travel in the hold, or the bottom of the ship. It was much cheaper to go third class as money was scarce. This slide shows an original drawing of the ship, the General McClellan. The journey was dreary. Mary was scared to death of the ocean and sailing, which could be why it took her a longer time to join the church, especially after she was told that they should go be with the saints. A scary experience to report during the voyage was when one of the sails of the ship hung over the cookhouse and caught fire, and it was thought at the time that the ship would burn. The saints cried and shouted around about the ship, saying the salt water will not put out the fire, but the sailors got the hose and pumps working, and the blaze was soon put out. But the sail was a total loss. At another point in the journey, there was a raging storm for 60 hours. It is said that they had to tie themselves down for 24 hours to keep them from being tossed over the ship. The ship was blown off course, and they found themselves floating in waters with icebergs. But they did see a whale, which to them was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. They landed in New York City on June 21st, 1864, and as soon as they saw the first sight of land, a great shout out of "America, America" went up from the eager thrones, and there was singing and dancing all day. From there, they were loaded on flatboat and sent up the river, and then they were loaded onto railroad cattle cars that took them to Nebraska, where they camped for 2 weeks. Now, during that time, it rained most of the time, and they had little to eat. On July 22nd, 1864, the Daybell family started their adventure to cross the plains with the Captain William S. Warren Company. This consisted of 65 wagons and 391 saints. Finity was a camp cook, and during this time his job was making fires and baking bread. They encountered many Indians along the way, even seeing the after effects of those people who were killed by the Indians. Now the Daybells had to walk most of the way, and about 2 weeks before they arrived in the valley, Finity took sick with mountain fever, and most thought that he would die before they arrived in the valley. They arrived in the Salt Lake City Valley on October 4th, 1864. Susanna, their 15-year-old daughter, who had come across the year before, met the wagon train, and both Finity and Mary were elated to see their daughter again. Susanna took them to the Gates Ranch, where they lived in a little log house located in Big Wheat Field. The log house walls were full of cracks, a dirt floor, a roof, and no windows, but it did have a door. At that time, the family worked in the sugarcane, wheat, and potato field. Finity made arrangements with James E. Taylor, who was the Mormon elder who taught them the gospel in England. The arrangements between the two men were to go to Charleston in what was once called the Upper Provo Valley, but now known as Heber. They arrived on Christmas Eve in 1864. When they arrived on the farm, they found a little house, 14 by 16. The walls were about 7 feet high. The house had a dirt roof and a big chimney and fireplace. They arrived in Charleston in 12 inches of snow. Now also in this little house lived a man and his 2 wives, and the man was sick in bed, and was obvious there was not enough room for the 5 Daybells. So at the side of the house was a little dugout, so Mary set up beds for the children, and this is where the children slept for the entire winter. Late spring, there was still 6 feet of snow on the ground, and food was scarce. Most of their meals were made from flour that was black with smut. It wasn't until the latter part of May before Finity could put in the grains in the field. But when the fall came and it was time to harvest the grain, a large snowstorm came and smashed the grain to the ground. As you can see, it was a hard, hard life. Now Robert, their eldest son, had to stay behind in England so he could save enough money to meet his parents later on. But a year later, in 1866, he brought his new bride Agnes and their baby daughter in hopes of reuniting with his family. However, Robert was lost when he was out hunting with his companion. Now later, Robert's little wife eventually made it to Utah and met the Daybells at the train at Echo Canyon. Now the Daybells were beside themselves losing their son, and of course the new little wife Agnes and the baby, who didn't know the Daybells. But they took her and the baby into their home, and for days and days there was such sorrow in the home. Now Brigham Young gave counsel not to go back and look for him. He said if the Indians had him and knew that they were looking for him, they would for sure take his life. So it was settled in the mind that nothing more could be done. But as time went on, in November, there came to Heber a man named Saunders from Springville, a good Latter-day Saint, and the Daybells had been told that he could tell them where Robert was as he used a peep stone. So Finity Daybell found him and made arrangements for him to come to the Daybell home the next morning. Before he started to do anything, he had them all kneel down and have a prayer. And when the prayer was over, he said to Mary Daybell, "Now, Sister Daybell, tell me as near as you can the year, the month, the day, and the hour that this boy was born," which she did. Saunders sat with a pen and paper and wrote the information. Now Saunders understood a little astrology, and he wanted to figure out and find the best planet under which Robert was born. As he began to write, then he began to tell Mary the life of this boy from infancy up until the day he was lost. He told her, "Your son nearly lost his life in a fire," and she said yes. And another time he said, "Your son nearly drowned." She said yes. They took him for the pond for dead, but he was revived, and through his life we have always nearly lost him, she stated. He continued to tell her of the scars upon the body of Robert and where and how they came to be, causing the mother to believe everything that the good brother said to her. Then he got out the peep stone, and he selected the youngest daughter in the family, who was about 11 years of the age, and said to her, "I will give you this stone because you will believe all I say." He then wrapped the stone in a red handkerchief and put it in both of her hands. One end of the stone was bare so she could look into it. She sat down by his side, and he would ask her if she could see anything. Well, at first she said no. Then he reached over and touched the end of the stone with his finger, and then asked if she could see anything, and she said yes. He asked her what she could see. She said, "I see my brother." "What is he doing?" he asked. She said, "He is walking down along an Indian trail on the side of a mountain." He then touched the stone again and asked her what she could see. "I still see my brother. He is in the edge of the beautiful hill. He has a gun on his shoulder, but he has no hat on his head." He again touched the end of the stone and asked her what she could see. She said, I still see my brother. He is on a beautiful hill. The moon is shining, and he's kneeling down to pray." At that point, she began to cry. He told her that she must not cry, or he'd have to take the stone away. He then again asked her, "Now what do you see?" Her reply was, "Oh, I see my brother. He's in a big river. He's in the water." She said, "Ask your brother why he does not come home." So she asked, "Brother, why don't you come home?" And then she said that he went down under the water. Mr. Saunders then took the stone away from her hands and said the son had drowned in the Platte River. When she saw him without his hat, he was bewildered. He was lost, and that is how he came to be undertaken by the cross of the river. He couldn't swim. He never had privileges to learn while he was young, and so he said that that was the end of Robert's life. He then turned to the little widow Agnes, who is crying as though her heart would break. He asked her to tell him as nearly as she could when and where she was born. Then he told her that in 4 to 5 years she would marry a light-complected man. He told her that she would bring forth posterity by this man, and their first children would be a pair of twin boys. So at this point she was not convinced, and he continued to tell her things that would happen in the future. Now, a month before Saunders came to tell the fate of Robert, Agnes had delivered her second daughter, and I'm sure she was uncertain of her and her daughter's futures. It was probably hard for her at that time to believe that she could find happiness again. Agnes lived with the Daybells for 4 to 5 years, and then came to Heber, a light-complected man whose name was George Moore, and true to the prophecy, she married him, and her first children were twin boys. In the spring of 1866, Chief Black Hawk declared war upon the settlers, and through the council of Brigham Young, all the little settlements on the outside of the valley were told to gather in one place. Finity followed the counsel given and moved his family into Heber for safety. It wasn't until the fall of 1877 that the family was able to move back to Charleston. At that point, they built their own home in a different place. Now, Finity continued to work for Joseph E. Taylor on his farm, but they were faced with many trials as the grasshoppers and the frost destroyed much of their crops. But eventually, Finity was able to purchase a small farm, now making Charleston their permanent home. Finity died on October 25th, 1897. Now, 14 years earlier, he had suffered a stroke, and later on, another stroke, and a third stroke left him paralyzed. He was 82 years old. And Mary lived 2 more years, but since the death of her husband, she too was in poor health. But she still lived in the old home in Charleston until about 6 months before she passed. She then moved in with her daughter, but from that point on, she was practically bedridden. She died on September 2nd, 1899, at the age of 79. And there you have a very short story of Finity and Mary Daybell. What faith and determination they had. We will never know the hardships and the heartbreaks they endured. And as you learn more about them, you honor them in their lives. Our family, Finity and Mary, true pioneers.
So here we are at Temple Square in front of the beautiful tabernacle. You have just finished part 1 of the Daybell connection. Now, there is no way that I can possibly give all the history of Mary and Finity Daybell, which they left a good resource of information for. So it's up to you to go and research more about Mary and Finity. So again, this is the end of part 1. Stay tuned for part 2 and the Daybell connection.